Hi there, and welcome to week 7 of Anatomy at SI. My name is Jayton Cranmore, and today we're going to talk about Lab 7, which is the central nervous system. First, we'll talk about Section 1, which is the terms to know. Alrighty, so here's Section 1. So for the first term that we want you to know, that's going to be cerebrospinal fluid. Cerebrospinal fluid is something that you might have heard before, but we're going to define what it is and kind of what its function is in our body. Cerebrospinal fluid is going to be this fluid that kind of circulates around our brain, right? It circulates around throughout our meninges, and it also circulates inside throughout some various spaces that we have available for that cerebrospinal fluid to kind of occupy. And the reason why it's so important is because it carries nutrients and then also helps cushion and provide protection for our brain. It's very important that this fluid is in there and kind of where it's supposed to be. We don't want it leaking into the brain as well. It's got to just kind of surround and protect the brain. All right, next we've got fissures. Fissures are kind of synonymous to sulci, but they're also a little bit different. Fissures are going to be these separations in our brain, right? And I like to think of fissures as being the main separators of like our lobes, right? They separate our various lobes and kind of the different portions of our brain. Sulci are going to be the different grooves that you see on the brain. So you see all of those different grooves, right? If we took spaghetti and jarbled it all together, it kind of looked similar to this, right? And so all of those little grooves between our little spaghetti strands, those are the sulci. And then gyri, right, or gyruses, those are going to be these ridges that kind of are in between those splits, right? So we've got gyri, which are these bumps, and then sulci, which are the valleys, right? I like to think of them like hills and valleys. We've got the hills, which are the gyri, and the sulcuses, which are the valleys. All right, now we've got some of the major grooves of the cerebrum. The first one that we need to know is the longitudinal fissure. The longitudinal fissure is going to divide the brain in half, right? So that's an anterior view, and from a posterior view, it just divides the brain in half along that mid-sagittal plane, right? So if we took the brain, chopped it in half along the mid-sagittal plane, had two halves, right? That would be the longitudinal fissure. It's a very large separating feature of our brain. Next, we've got the central sulcus. The central sulcus is going to separate the parietal and frontal lobes. And so if we look at a kind of would that be, a superior view of our brain, we see the central sulcus is going to be right here, separating our frontal lobe from our parietal lobes, right? That's the central sulcus. Okay. Next, we've got the lateral sulcus. The lateral sulcus is going to separate the temporal lobes from the rest of the other lobes that are found in our brain, right? So we've got this kind of lateral sulcus right there, separating the temporal lobe from the frontal and the parietal lobes. All right, so that's the lateral sulcus. Let's go ahead and talk about the different gyri of the cerebrum. So the first important, and remember, a gyrus, right? A gyrus or a gyri is just a ridge, right? It's just one of these ridges on the brain. The first one that we want you to know is the precentral gyrus, which is also known as the primary motor cortex, and it's found on the frontal lobe. It's this, or it's actually, if you take a look at this frontal lobe, right, it's this last gyri right before you get to, here, let me use a pen instead of my fat finger. It's this last gyri right before you get to the parietal lobe, right? It's this last gyri found on the frontal lobe. So that's the precentral gyrus. Next, we've got the postcentral gyrus. The postcentral gyrus is found on the parietal lobe, and it's going to be this first most anterior gyrus found on the parietal lobe. So we've got the precentral gyrus and the postcentral gyrus. And we call them pre and postcentral because they're along that central sulcus, right? Precentral, postcentral. So remember where those both are, and remember that they're quite important, right? This one controls all of our motor mobilities, and this one is, or motor abilities, and this one controls all of our our sensory cortex abilities. So we've got precentral, motor, postcentral, sensory. All right. The first way to kind of tackle the brain is to separate it into its different lobes because they have various association areas and processing centers that are very helpful in kind of, differentiating before you dive into the brain. And so the first one that we're going to find, the first lobe, is the frontal lobe, and it's up front, right? It's this pink lobe right here. That's the frontal lobe, and it contains a lot of our higher level executive processing skills and functioning, right? Like thinking, problem solving, all of those kind of like higher level human capabilities, right? Now, the frontal lobe also houses some different areas that we need to be aware of, like the primary motor cortex. Remember when we talked about the precentral gyrus, right? That's this gyrus right here, this last gyrus on the frontal lobe. That is the primary motor cortex, and it controls most of our motor movements, right? The premotor cortex, so if we've got the primary motor cortex up here, the premotor cortex is going to be this region down here that's just almost touching the temporal lobe, right? The premotor cortex is inferior to the primary motor cortex, and it touches the temporal lobes. It controls most of our voluntary movement. So that's right here, right? That's voluntary movement from the premotor cortex. The frontal eye field is also on the premotor cortex, and it's at the very bottom, right here, touching the temporal lobe. And then we've also got the, and that controls physical, like motor eye movement, right? So looking left, right, all of that's controlled by this. We've also got some motor movement of the eyes controlled by the occipital lobe, but most of it controlled by the frontal eye field right here. Okay. And notice that some of these, like the premotor cortex and the frontal eye field, you can't really see or differentiate on with the model. Just be aware of like the primary motor cortex as a whole for this one, but realize that there's also these structures on the lobe as well. Next, we've got the motor speech area, which is the Broca's area, and this Broca's area is actually going to be kind of on both the temporal and the frontal lobe. That's right here, right? And so Broca's area is going to control our motor speech production. And so I'm using Broca's area right now to produce this speech, and then I use a different brain area, Wernicke's, to understand speech. Okay, but Broca's area is on the frontal lobe, right there. All right, next we've got the prefrontal cortex, and the prefrontal cortex is going to be basically just the upper layer of the frontal lobe, just like this outer superficial most layer. And it's responsible for higher level thinking capabilities and problem solving, kind of those executive functions that I was talking about before. Okay, next, let's move into the temporal lobes. The temporal lobes are going to be these yellow lobes that are on the side of our brain, right? And they house the primary auditory cortex. That's hearing, right? Auditory, hearing. And temporal lobes, right? Tempo, temporal. I'm a musician, and so when I listen to tempos, it helps me keep time, and I listen to tempos with my ears, right? Using my temporal lobes. Okay. On the temporal lobe, we've got the primary auditory cortex, which you can't really see, but just know that it's within this lobe. There's also the auditory association area, which is found within the Wernicke's speech processing area. That's down kind of in this region. Again, can't see it, but just know kind of where it is, right? It overlaps the junction of the temporal and the parietal lobes. So it's just kind of in this area right here, right? Or sorry, this area right here, overlapping the junction between the temporal and parietal lobes. So this blue lobe here and this yellow lobe, that's where that Wernicke's area would be. And that's understanding language, right? All right. So we've got primary auditory complex, and we also have the primary olfactory complex, which is going to be found in the temporal lobe. But again, we can't see it. Just know that it's found within this yellow lobe. Okay. Next, let's move on to the parietal lobes. So we've learned about the frontal lobe, right? The temporal lobes on each side. Now we've got both parietal lobes. So parietal lobes are going to be on top. That's the blue one right here. So this lobe is going to house our primary somatosensory cortex. We talked about the primary motor cortex, which is this last gyrus on the frontal lobe. Now let's talk about the primary somatosensory cortex, which is the first gyri on the parietal lobe. Okay? So the primary somatosensory cortex is the first gyri on the parietal lobe, and it houses all of it helps us kind of process different senses, right? The somatosensory association area is going to be this region kind of at the lower end of the parietal lobe that's closer to the temporal lobe. And that is the region, it's posterior to the primary somatosensory cortex, so it's down here, and then it's also back here, right? Just behind that first gyrus. And it helps to kind of, and just together, this whole region is helping to process the various senses that our body is taking in from our skin, from our eyes, or not from our eyes, but from just various senses around the body. Like especially touch, feel, right, temperature, those kind of senses. Okay, let's go ahead and shoot on over to the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe is on the very back, right? So if we take the brain and we look at the very most posterior aspect, this green lobe, right? That's the occipital lobe. It's the most posterior lobe on our brain, and it houses the primary visual cortex, right? So that's from our vision. Our eyes take in information up here and they shoot it back through the thalamus and it hits the back of our brain on the occipital lobe, right? We've got the primary visual cortex, which is going to be this outer region surrounding kind of the, I call it the apex, or like the back of the occipital lobe, right? But it's just this region surrounding the very backmost part of the occipital lobe. And then this backmost region, this point of our occipital lobe, kind of is the visual association area. So we've got the visual association area right here, everything within what I'm circling, and then the primary visual cortex, which is kind of everything on the outside of what I'm circling. That would be all of this up here, as opposed to this right here. Okay, so we've got the primary visual cortex and the visual association area, which is just right there. Okay. Last but not least, we have the insula, and unfortunately, I cannot show you the insula on this model. But if I took this frontal lobe and I took this temporal lobe and I just peeled them back, right, you would actually see another smaller lobe that's beneath those two, and that is our insula. It houses the our primary gustatory cortex, which is actually responsible for our taste, right? So everything that has to do with taste comes from the insula, which is just beneath this kind of this sulcus right here. If we were to lift it open, right, we could see that insula just inside. All right, let's go ahead and move on to section 2. We talked about all of the different lobes of the brain. Now let's go ahead and talk about the commissural tracts. So commissural tract just means connecting region of the brain. So let's go ahead and crack the brain open along that mid-sagittal line, right? That longitudinal fissure. We're cracking the brain in half. All right, and now we're going to take a look at the corpus callosum. So if you see this solid white structure right there, the solid like cream looking structure, that there is going to be the corpus callosum, and it's kind of the first connecting tract that we have between our two brain hemispheres, right? So this region of nerves, it's a region of white matter or like that myelinated matter, right? Those myelinated axons that communicate information back and forth between the two hemispheres of the brain. That's this cream colored kind of region surrounding those lines right there. Okay, next we've got the anterior commissure. The anterior commissure isn't just one structure on this model. It encompasses all of the white matter that is kind of found along the bottom of our brain, and it connects the two regions of our brain, or our two hemispheres of our brain together, right? And so it's just all of the white matter found along this anterior line, right? And it actually stretches all the way down the spinal cord, all the way to the bottom. All right, let's go ahead and dive into the ventricles now. So we talked earlier about that cerebrospinal fluid, right? That's that fluid that helps to cushion and provide nutrients to our brain. And so that fluid not only circulates on the outside of our brain through that subarachnoid space, right? It also circulates on the inside of our brain through these different ventricles. Okay, so for the first one, let's talk about the lateral ventricle. The lateral ventricles are going to be, again, there's two of these, right? Because we've got two brain hemispheres. We're just looking at one of them because it's easier to see this on the model when we're looking inside. But remember, there's two of these ventricles, two of each of these. So we've got the lateral ventricle, right? Lateral ventricle is going to be right here. And it's this line, it's kind of this line-filled region on the model, right? You can see it's just this, it's an open space that's inside this corpus callosum, right? So it's this line space inside. Next, we've got the third ventricle, which is going to be just directly above the midbrain, and it's this region right here. It's also where we find the thalamus. It kind of surrounds that whole region. Next, we've got the fourth ventricle, which is going to flow down in front of the cerebellum. And then lastly, we have the choroid plexus, which surrounds the third ventricle. That's going to be this structure right here, kind of divides the third ventricle and the fourth ventricle. Here's the lateral ventricle, right? It divides the lateral ventricles from the third ventricle right here. That's the choroid plexus, dividing the lateral ventricle from the third ventricle, with the fourth ventricle down here. Okay, now that we got those all lined up, let's go ahead and talk about the different structures of the diencephalon. The diencephalon is kind of this middle brain, right? This middle region. It's considered the small brain within our larger brain, right? It contains lots of white matter and commissural tracts. Commissural tracts are just regions of highly myelinated axons that allow for very fast nerve travel, right? These signals can move very quickly between the two hemispheres of the brain and go to different areas of the brain or even back down into the spine, get sent down, received. There's lots of stuff going on within this white matter commissural tract area. So let's talk about the different structures within the diencephalon. The first one is the thalamus. The thalamus is found in the same area as the third ventricle, right? It's the structure inside of the third ventricle, whereas the third ventricle is just the space that kind of surrounds it. It also filters nerve signals. So when we get a bunch of different signals coming up from our spine that all reach up into this thalamus, the thalamus is going to decide whether those signals are important or not. Like, for example, can you feel the bottom of your feet right now? You probably couldn't before I said that, right? But after I said it, you oddly enough could feel the bottom of your feet. And why was that? Was that because the nerves weren't sending the signals before, or were they always sending them and you just maybe weren't feeling them? The second answer is right. Your feet were always sending those nerve signals, but the issue, or I guess not the issue, but the affordance that you have is that your thalamus, this region right here, is filtering out those nerve signals that come from the bottom of your feet in other regions on your body that you don't need right now. I don't need to feel the bottom of my feet all day, and that's why the thalamus filters out that signal for me. So this is the thalamus right there. It's that nerve filter. Next, we've got the hypothalamus, which is going to be directly anterior to the thalamus. On this model, it kind of looks like this little triangle doohickey right there. Yeah, that's where I'm pointing to, 34. And with the hypothalamus, it links the endocrine system to the nervous system. So as you can see, we've got this gland down here, which we'll talk about. That's the pituitary gland connected by the infundibulum. So this pituitary gland is connected through that infundibulum, that little tiny point, and it connects onto our hypothalamus. And that forms the connection point between our endocrine system, right, the primary master gland, and our nervous system, the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is helping to control our endocrine system through the infundibulum and exerting its influence on that master gland, which is also known as the pituitary gland. Okay. Next, we've got the epithalamus. The epithalamus is going to be directly above and kind of posterior to the thalamus. And you can't really see it on this model, but it's right in this area, right? And the last structure that we need to know about that's in the diencephalon is the pineal gland, which is going to be this small little bulb right back here. The pineal gland is going to house our secretory cells that secrete melatonin. Melatonin helps us with our circadian rhythm cycle. And so it helps us go to sleep and help us wake up in the morning, right? It releases that melatonin, kind of like, I'm sure you've heard of melatonin supplements, right? You can take a melatonin pill and it helps you go to sleep. You naturally have melatonin that's stored and produced in this little gland. And when it's released, it helps you become tired, you fall asleep, right? All right. Let's go ahead and dive into the structures of the brainstem now. So after the diencephalon, right, that's this whole region up here. Now we're going to talk about the mesencephalon. Mesencephalon is going to be directly below the diencephalon, and it found right here, right? So we've got the diencephalon up here. Mesencephalon is going to be this region right here. And on the model, you can see it's denoted by these 3 different lines, right? This is your mesencephalon right there. Okay. Next, we've got the pons. The pons is just this large bulbous region right here. And all of these structures are inferior to the thalamus, which is up here, right? We've got the thalamus, we've got the mesencephalon, and then we've got the pons, which is right here. All right. Directly beneath the pons, which, oh, by the way, before we hop off the pons is very important because it helps regulate that circadian sleep-wake cycle that we talked about, kind of pairing with this gland over here, right? And then it also helps us with our unconscious breathing, right? It's this rounded bulbous region right here on the brainstem. And last but not least, we have the medulla oblongata for all of our Waterboy fans out there, right? It connects the brain to the spine and it controls vitals like our heartbeat, breathing, and blood pressure. Some people call it the lizard brain, right? That's the medulla oblongata down at the bottom. All right. All right, yeah, we're not quite done yet. Let's go ahead and talk about the structures of the cerebellum as well. So we've talked about all of these structures so far, except for this guy, right? What is that? That there is the cerebellum, and it's composed of two separate lobes, all right? And I feel like they're kind of easier to see when we put this together. Yeah, see that? All right. So we can see how there's kind of this bulbed region right here, and then this less bulbed region right here. And if we drew a line that divided that bulbed region all the way across, right? That would be, here, I'm gonna put my pen, and everything above the pen is going to be the anterior lobe, whereas everything below the pen is the posterior lobe. The anterior lobe is going to control unconscious proprioception, whereas the posterior lobe controls and coordinates movement by determining strength and the direction of that movement, right? So these structures are helping to coordinate our various postural muscles to help kind of keep our movement steady and keep it from being too rocky, and also help us from falling while we're moving, right? Something that we definitely don't want to do. We don't want to break bones. All right, now that's section 2. Let's go ahead and dive into section 3. All right, next we've got section 3. This will be structures of the spinal cord. So first we've got the cervical enlargement. The cervical enlargement is going to be this region right up here, right? It's kind of up in the neck. And it's, again, with these ones, it's kind of hard to like specify exactly where the cervical region is. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna put, right there is the bottom, there's the top, everywhere between my pen, all right? That's the cervical enlargement, everywhere between where I'm putting my pen at. Cervical enlargement exists up in the neck. All right, next we've got the lumbosacral enlargement. The lumbosacral enlargement is gonna be more kind of right down here, right? Lumbosacral enlargement, right down here. Next we've got the conus medullaris. If you look at the bottom of the spine, it kind of looks like it furls out into a cone, right? Or kind of comes down into the point of a cone right down here. And that point, or the end of that, is called the conus medullaris. All right, that's the conus medullaris. Down towards the inferior aspect, we've got the cauda equina. Cauda equina, if you think of equina, equine means horse in Latin, right? So the cauda equina, it just literally means horsetail. And if you look at this, it looks like a horsetail, right? All of these bundles of nerves that are extending off of the bottom portion of our spine, right? That is the cauda equina. And last but not least, we've got the filum terminale. The filum terminale are going to be all of these little ending regions of those nerves that are coming off of the cauda equina, all right? Those are the filum terminale. Again, for these, I wouldn't stress too much. Just definitely look at how your TAs are pointing at these at lab, because how they point at them during lab is going to be how they point at them during the quizzes as well. And I may not be pointing at it exactly like how they will, because these structures are so hard to just distinguish right on this model. But remember, you've got your cervical enlargement up here, your lumbosacral enlargement kind of in this region down here. You've got your conus medullaris, which is the beginning of that cone right there. You've got the cauda equina, which is all these horsetails going on down here, and the filum terminale, which is just all of the ends of those nerves at the bottom of the cauda equina, okay? Awesome. Let's go ahead and take a look at the cross-section of the spinal cord. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at a cross-section of the spinal cord. So first, let's take a look at the posterior roots. The posterior root is going to be this guy right here, all right? This posterior root, or if we look over here, this is the posterior root coming off of the side or the lateral aspect of our spinal cord as well. And these posterior roots only house sensory nerves, right? So only sensory nerves are going through or moving through these nerve tracts, all right? And these are in the posterior roots. On top of the posterior root, we find the posterior root ganglia. The posterior root ganglia is this bulge that's on the posterior root, and it houses a bunch of nerve cell bodies, right? This ganglia is a communicating region for those nerves, in that there's an end region of the nerve before and a nerve cell body in this ganglia that then can catch that signal and transport it, or I guess in this case, since it's sensory, we're transporting it back up from the body and into the central nervous system, right? All of these signals are moving into the spine. So Now that we've talked about the posterior roots, that's these back ones, right, with the ganglia on them, let's move on to the anterior roots. The anterior roots are these roots up here at the end of my pen, all right? That's the anterior root. Anterior roots primarily have to do with motor responses, right? Motor nerves. And so we can see how these color-coded nerves are different, right? We've got sensory up here on the posterior root, and we've got motor down here on the anterior root. Notice that there is no ganglia on the anterior root. That ganglia is only found on the posterior root. Okay, so anterior roots only have to do with motor responses, motor nerves. Let's go ahead and move on to the posterior ramus. The posterior ramus, we actually can't see on this model. I'm gonna pull up another model here. It's a little bit bigger, a little bit crazier. Okay, so as we can see, we've still got the same structure, just a little bit bigger, a little bit blown up, right? Here's our spinal cord. We can see our posterior roots right here, our anterior roots right here, and they leave the spinal cord, right? And then they join together in this larger ramus, right? And then they split into the posterior ramus down here and the anterior ramus down here. Looking at the other side, we see how it splits, right? After these join at this ganglia, they split to the posterior ramus and to the anterior ramus right there. Okay, so we've got those down. Let's go ahead and go back to our other model that we had. All right, so the smaller model, a little bit easier to manage. Let's go ahead and talk about the rami communicantes. So rami communicantes are going to be these little tiny nerves that are kind of extending off of this ramus, right? They're extending off of this nerve kind of exists before we split into the anterior and posterior ramuses. And these rami communicantes just are these nerves that kind of exit before that split into the two different ramuses. Okay. Last but not least, we have the different structures of the interior of our spinal cord, right? We've got two different types of nerve tracts in here. We've got white matter and gray matter. As you can see, the white matter is surrounding the gray matter, and this is only the case inside the spinal cord. We know that in the brain, it's the other way around, right? That gray matter is actually surrounding the white matter. And structurally, it's built that way for a reason. All right, let's go ahead and talk about the posterior horns. So if we've got the posterior root back here, right, we know that the posterior posterior horns of the gray matter are going to be this right here and this right here, right? They have to do with that sensory cortex, right? They're connected with the sensory nerves we see. And then we have the anterior horns, which are directly in front of them, right? Anterior horns down here. We've got posterior horn right here, anterior horn right here, posterior, anterior. The anterior horns have to do with motor responses, right? With motor reflexes and also motor control. Okay, let's go ahead and, well, yeah, that looks like the rest of the structures for our spinal cord. So we're wrapping up the spinal cord right there, and let's go ahead and talk about the different coverings of our central nervous system. All right, last but not least, we've got section 4, which is going to be the protective coverings of the brain. So my drawing up here, I'm sorry for its crudeness, but it doesn't quite start with where your lab manual does, because your lab manual starts with the skin and the periosteum and then the bone skull. Mine is just going to start with the bone, all right? So the bone is that purple layer on top, all right? So just know that we've got a periosteal covering on top of that bone, just like any other bone, and then there's skin also wrapping on top of that as well, all right? So we've got skin and periosteum on top of that bone skull that are helping to protect the bone itself. And the bone is protecting the first layer of our meninges. So meninges, right? What the hell is a meninge? A meninge, if you've ever heard of meningitis, that's inflammation of the tissue that surrounds our brain. So a meninge, therefore, is just the tissue that surrounds our brain. Just like every other structure that we've learned about has a surrounding layer, so does our brain, and our brain's extremely important. Let's talk about those layers. The first layer of our meninges is the dura mater. The dura mater is the outermost layer of the meninges, and it consists of two different layers, the periosteal layer and the meningeal layer, all right? You can see that green and that black layer, those are the periosteal and meningeal layers of the dura mater. So again, that dura mater has two layers, the periosteal layer and the meningeal layer. Next, we've got the arachnoid matter. The arachnoid matter is going to be the layer that is just, yes. So we've got the arachnoid matter, which is just that red line right there, right? And it's connected onto the meningeal layer of the dura mater. But you'll notice that there's a space in between the arachnoid matter and the last layer, the pia mater. There's like an actual physical space there inside of our central nervous system. And it's called the subarachnoid space, right? That's this right here. The subarachnoid space is that space between the arachnoid matter and the pia mater, and it allows for the circulation of cerebrospinal fluid. It's extremely important for helping to cushion our brain, and it also helps to distribute resources and nutrients to our brain. Very important. Last but not least, we've got the lowermost layer, or the innermost layer of our meninges, which is the pia mater. The pia mater is the only layer of the meninges that's actually touching the brain. It covers the top of the brain and, again, is kind of contributing to the area that's around that space that is the subarachnoid space. But the pia mater is directly on top of the brain. So I like to think of the meninges kind of like a pad that surrounds your brain, PAD, right? Pia, arachnoid, and then you've got your dura, right? Pad that surrounds the brain, right? And you also like to pamper your brain, right? You don't want it to not get what it needs. You want to pamper your brain, right? PAMP. You've got pia, arachnoid, meningeal, and periosteal layers. So make sure you're taking a look at the layers of those meninges and know how they function on your brain. Now, before we're done, make sure you remember that these layers of the meninge are not just on the brain. They actually cover your entire central nervous system. So let's take a look at how those meninges are covering the spinal cord. Okay, so we've got a cross section of our spinal cord right here, and we're going to talk about the protective coverings and how they surround our spinal cord. First, we've got the vertebral column. The vertebral column is just our spine itself and how it surrounds and protects our spinal cord. So it doesn't allow the space in here to really compress or change. That way the spinal cord isn't infringed upon. It can just send its signals unimpeded, right? Now, let's go ahead and talk about the next layer. We've got the vertebral column, that's the bone itself, right? Next, we've got the epidural space. The epidural space is going to be this yellow layer right here. It's got fat and blood vessels in it. You can see those blood vessels right there, right? So that yellow is fat, and it's fat and blood vessels existing within that epidural space, right? Next, we've got the spinal dural sheath, which is just a fancy way of saying dura mater. And so dura mater, right, if we think back to this drawing up here, that's around the brain, the dura mater, all of those meninges, sorry for that whiplash there, but all of those meninges are just extending off of the brain and shooting down the spinal cord to help protect this spinal cord, right? Okay, so we've got the vertebral column, we've got the epidural space, which is that yellow fatty space that has the blood vessels in it, right? Next, we've got the dural sheath, which is also known as the dura mater. That's this top layer to this, right? You can see that top layer. Next, we have the subdural space. The subdural space is going to be just this little tiny space in between the dural or the dura mater and the arachnoid mater, which is this lower layer, right? You got the arachnoid mater, which is this lower layer. You've got the dura mater, which is this upper layer, and you've got the subdural space, which is just in between them. This space right here, right, this open space that allows for the circulation of cerebrospinal fluid, that's the subarachnoid space, right? If this is the arachnoid layer, sub just beneath it is the subarachnoid space. And then just on top of the spinal cord, we've got the pia mater, right? Just like how the pia mater surrounds the brain, it also surrounds the spinal cord. That's our pia mater, which is the layer that's directly on top of the spinal cord. All right, that is all of Lab 7, the central nervous system. Good luck on your quiz this week, and I'll see you for the next one.